And also, because I'm addressing the Australian Institute of International Affairs, I want to look at the theme as advanced by my humble book of whether, of how the Cold War shaped not only the foreign policy values, but the basic political values and identity of a generation, at least a generation, probably 3 generations, of Australian political leaders. And then, does that experience have any lessons for today, and what are the consequences in terms of political values of the end of the Cold War back at the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s, nearly a quarter of a century ago. My book is called When We Were Young and Foolish, a memoir of my misguided youth, with Tony Abbott, Bob Carr, Malcolm Turnbull, Kevin Rudd and other reprobates. And it's interesting that every significant character in the book has their outlook on life more or less completely shaped by the struggles of the Cold War. Now, of course, this is interpreted through their own life experience and their own values that come from their families and their own reflections on issues of the day and so forth. But in a way that certainly doesn't exist today, the Cold War was the prism through which all politics was interpreted, I think in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, certainly. I went to university first in 1975, and the first political event that I remember in my life was the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 on my birthday, oddly enough. And this was a very big deal for us Irish Catholics in inner Western Sydney, because in a sense Kennedy was our president. We were very proud of him. We felt about him the way that Africans feel about Barack Obama, that he showed that an Irish person could be the best person in the world. We also felt, in a sense, that the assassination of Kennedy was part of the malign anti-Catholic forces at work in the world. You know, a good solid dose of paranoia was very important to Catholic identity in the 1950s and 60s, and we didn't feel that it was just a random madman. We felt that this was part of the hostility to the church. And the chief agent of hostility to the church, of course, was international communism. Not that we thought Kennedy had been assassinated by the communists, although, frankly, I am still very drawn to the Cuban theory rather than to the FBI theory. If you give me a choice, was it the Cuban dictatorship or the FBI? I'm inclined to choose the Cuban dictatorship. However, that remains unproved at best. But we certainly, our outlook at that time was that Catholics and the Church generally were being persecuted in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and China and many other countries in Asia. And this was not an exclusively Catholic concern, because the communists were certainly persecuting a good chunk of humanity, not just Catholics. But this sense that the Soviet Union was the enemy and the enemy behind all other enemies was very vibrant, real part of growing up as a politically aware Irish Catholic in the 50s and 60s. Also in 1963, I started watching and listening to the broadcasts of BA Santa Maria on Point of View, first on Channel 7, then on Channel 9. So a perfect Sunday morning for us would be that we'd go to Mass at 9 or 10 o'clock, we'd come home, watch Vincent Cervantes' Nature's Walkabout. I lived in the inner western suburbs of Sydney, very concrete, jungle kind of place, not much nature around, so I thought Australian nature occurred in black and white in those days, just as I thought history occurred in black and white. Then you'd watch Ron Casey's Wide World of Sports, which in Sydney was mainly about rugby league. Then you'd watch Bob Santa Maria telling you that it was 1 minute to midnight and the enemy was at our second last line of defences. And then, because you were in a martial spirit, you'd watch World Championship Wrestling. Mario Milano, Killer Kowalski, and poor old hopeless Larry O'Day. The Australian was always the boot cop in that lineup. Anyway, that was our Sunday morning, and they were enjoyable Sunday mornings. As teenage years went on, I was about 16, I guess, when the Whitlam government was elected, and I was very concerned that the Whitlam government contained too many people who were pro-communist, and especially that Whitlam wanted a communist victory in Vietnam. Not merely that he didn't want Australia to participate in Vietnam, but that he wanted a communist victory in Vietnam. you know, this silly orthodoxy has grown up that the people who supported the South Vietnamese were somehow or other on the wrong side. I supported the South Vietnamese and the Cambodians and the Laos in their struggle against communism. And I was very confident that if the communists won, they would do terrible things to those people. And that's exactly what happened. When they won in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, the communists, the Red Khmers, they inaugurated one of the most terrible genocides in the history of the 20th century, in the history of humanity. But believe me, their victory in South Vietnam was pretty horrible too. Massive gulags, hundreds of thousands of people in re-education camps, maybe 1.5 million refugees, pogroms against ethnic Chinese, against Buddhists, against Catholics, against anyone associated with the old government. And I think the Santa Maria crew, in a sense, were unusual in having a primary concern the fate of the Vietnamese and the other Indo-Chinese. The left in Australian politics, of course, as soon as the Americans were defeated, had absolutely no interest in what happened in Vietnam or Cambodia. In fact, for most of 76 and 77, the left denied that there was anything untoward happening under the Khmer Rouge. They just said it was all lies, this talk of the Holocaust. At Sydney University, I went to Macquarie in 1975, transferred to Sydney in 1976, and there I met Tony Abbott, who did indeed become my best friend, poor bugger, and he's had to wear the millstone of his friendship with me around his neck ever since. Our meeting was most auspicious. We both ran for class representative of Economics 1, quantitative methods or something it was called. At Sydney University, you had to, everything was very, very politicised by the mid-1970s, and you had to make a political choice as soon as you enrolled. So there was mainstream economics, which was purely mathematics, and there was political economy, which was purely Marxism. And the university, I thought, rather failed me because I wasn't a mathematician and I wasn't a Marxist, and I thought there had to be some other alternative somewhere in the middle. Anyway, I took the mathematical side of economics because I disliked maths less than I disliked Marxists, although having struggled with quantitative methods in economics, it became a near thing, really. And in any event, Tony and I both ran to be class representative. We had no program, no idea what the class representative did, no reason to want to run other than high spirits, egotism, madness. We ran against each other, and I have to tell you, modesty forbids me from telling you who won that debate. But I will remark that any politician who can lose a student election to me is not infallible and is not unbeatable. But amidst the many, many characters in my book, the four who get the biggest billing, Abbott, Rudds, Carr and Turnbull, with the partial exception of Turnbull, were completely formed by the politics of the Cold War. So Tony, like me, was a very determined anti-communist. In 1976 and 77, he and I and another bloke put out a journal called Democrat, which was the journal of the Sydney University Democratic Club, which was the BA Santa Maria aligned group. And in 76 and 77, overwhelmingly, we wrote about the Cambodian Holocaust, and we campaigned for Indo-Chinese refugees to come to Australia. Little known oubliette of history that the first political party in Australia to oppose a white Australia policy was in fact the Democratic Labor Party, which owed its existence really to Bob Santa Maria. We also campaigned fiercely against communist control of student politics. And in those days, it wasn't, you know, hobbit-like greenies and furry, friendly folk who controlled student politics. It was hardline members of one or other of the communist parties. You'll recall, of course, because this is central to everyone's life, that there were three main communist parties in Australia: the pro-Soviet Socialist Party of Australia, which controlled the Building Workers Industrial Union. It was led by Pat Clancy. When he won the Order of Lenin, it was front page news on Pravda, and they took a lot of money from the Soviet Union. There was the Maoist group, the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninists. Their most famous adherent was Norm Gallagher in the Builders Labourers Federation, but their leader was Ted Hill. They took a lot of money from the Chinese communists, and the notionally independent Communist Party of Australia, which had some criticisms of the Soviet Union, but ended up taking a lot of patronage from the Soviet Union and still took positions which were never really strongly opposed to Soviet interests. these three groups, plus a range of mad Trotskyists, were the folks in control of student politics when I was at university. They controlled the Student Representative Council at Sydney University, and they controlled the Australian Union of Students. And you know, the great Yugoslav philosopher Milovan Djilas remarked that at the beginning of everything is moral outrage. Well, it was moral outrage of this that propelled Tony Abbott and me into political activism. We were outraged that they were taking our money and sending it first to the Viet Cong and later to the PLO. And they, the left, were also obsessed or fully involved with the issues of the Cold War, which had a predominantly international dimension, the struggle, as they put it, for liberation around the world, but it also had a domestic orientation. Communists were very powerful in trade unions, had a lot of support at universities, controlled a lot of institutions. The Australian Union of Students had a budget in 1977 of $750,000. That's a lot of money for political organisation, especially back then. The Sydney Uni SRC had a budget of $140,000, a lot of money for political campaigning back then. So Abbott and I became immersed in the struggle against AUS, and this had some hilarious harem-scarum activities. One of our strokes of absolute genius was we came to an AUS conference at Monash University in Melbourne, and we decided, Tony and I and two others, to attend a PLO film night to register our protest because we thought AUS had no business running PLO film nights with our money. And if they were going to do that with our money, we had a right to be there and make a protest. Now, these people on the left believed that they had the right to make the most violent protests anyone could imagine against mainstream politicians, but they utterly detested the idea that anyone would protest against them. So the four of us arrived at this PLO film night, and we were heckling the film a bit. They stopped the film, told us to leave, and we were outnumbered about 40 to 4, and at this point I said to Tony, mate, I think we've made our point, we could leave now, you know. And they were a bit unsure of their odds, so they pulled up 20 or 30 reinforcements. And luckily, the only time in his life, Tony's inclination was very much to stand his ground. That's always his inclination. He, like many people in my book, but not like the author, he's absolutely fearless. And so a mere 70 or 80 dedicated communists about to tear him limb from limb was no reason for him to leave, whereas I thought it was very persuasive. I thought, as Henry Kissinger put it, that the correlation of means and ends had broken down a little bit, and that strategic withdrawal would be not graceless. And eventually, the other two fellows there and I convinced Tony that we would make our retreat. And of course, the next day it was all plastered all over campus as savage right-wing attack on innocent Palestinian film night, you know, this sort of thing. Complete madness, of course. But this struggle against really communist, not only far left, but communist domination of student politics at that time was formative in Tony Abbott's mind and in mine. And it propelled him to take strong positions which were hotly contested by other people. And it compelled him to think deeply about what was the purpose of political activism, what was he doing. He was in solidarity with the Vietnamese who were fleeing Vietnam. He was in solidarity with the people in the gulags in the Soviet Union. He was in solidarity with the victims of communism everywhere, and he was going to stop the communists from having control in Australia. Now, of course, as the years have gone by, he has evolved, broadened, changed his political outlook, but this was the root of his activism. In a completely different context, the same is also a little bit true of Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd was not a student activist, as far as I know, and I didn't meet Kevin until 1985, when I was posted as the Australian newspaper's first ever correspondent to China, and Kevin was a junior diplomat there. And the press corps included Robert Thompson, who's now the chief executive of News Corporation, Elaine Chung and myself. We were the Australian press corps. You can see Robert has ascended a little higher in the profession than I have, but as have most of the people in this book. We had a weekly briefing from the ambassador, and we could ask for it to be briefed on any topic we liked. And I asked one week to be briefed on human rights in China. So I got a call from the PR guy at the embassy who said, look, this is rather a delicate topic. We don't really want to over-excite your colleagues. Perhaps you could come in privately to the embassy and we'll brief you on this subject privately. And the person they chose to brief me was Kevin Rudd. That was surprising because it was a very delicate subject, and Kevin was at that stage quite a junior diplomat on only his second ever posting. The Department of Foreign Affairs, with its normal inscrutable genius, had spent years and many thousands of dollars training him in perfect Mandarin and then posted him to Sweden. That's more or less a routine career progression for DFAT, but then in a spasm of lucidity, they actually then posted him to Beijing, where his skills were. But my claim to being a footnote in Australian political history is that I was in fact the first journalist that Kevin Rudd ever briefed on anything. Obviously I made it a very pleasant experience for him because he's never stopped doing it ever since. I may have been the first of 50,000 or 100,000 journalistic briefings that Kevin conducted. But it was very obvious to us all that Kevin was the smartest guy in the embassy and was destined for great things. I didn't think he'd be Prime Minister because he didn't seem to be on a political road, but we all thought he'd be the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade or the head of the Prime Minister's office or something. But as I got to know Kevin well, I realised that the Cold War issues were absolutely fundamental to Kevin's outlook as well. Kevin did his honours thesis at the ANU in Chinese under the great Belgian-Australian sinologist Pierre Ryckmans, and he did his honours thesis on the writings of the Chinese dissident Wei Jingsheng, who was very famous for his pamphlet, The Fifth Modernisation. You know, the dusty Stalinist bureaucrats who ran China put everything in sort of small slogans, and I remember there was one on, used to see on the wall, marry late, have one child and support the four modernisations. Can't remember what the four modernisations were, agriculture and the economy and bridge planning or something, I don't know. But and Wei Jingsheng wrote this brilliant pamphlet at the time of the democracy movement in China, that the fifth modernisation was the modernisation of Chinese society into democracy. And Rudd, who mastered Mandarin, who got a first-class honours in his thesis about Wei Jingsheng. So Kevin had internalised the struggle for democracy within China more profoundly than perhaps any other than a handful of Australians. Read Wei Jingsheng's article in Chinese, assessed it, analysed it, to the extent that Pierre Ryckmans, who was a brilliant, savagely anti-communist, deeply thoughtful, brilliant sinologist, the greatest sinologist really ever to work in Australia, one of the great people of literature of the 20th century, awarded him a first-class honours. And in China, Kevin had to deal not only with the Chinese communists, but he had specific responsibility for Australia's relations with North Korea. Now, that is no bucket of fun anywhere, let me tell you. They came around one time demanding visas to come to a conference, and they'd just blown up the Burmese government or something, and the Australian government was a little hesitant about giving them visas, and their diplomat grabbed Kevin by the lapels and threw him against the wall and said, "Tomorrow we are coming, Mr. Rudd, and you will have good news for us." And in a sense, he had a kind of a at-the-coalface experience of the Cold War, which other Australians didn't. He later wrote a very long and serious paper for the then Foreign Minister Bill Hayden on the nature of the Soviet threat. So Kevin came to international politics via very much a Cold War education, and a Cold War education much sharper, I think, than the average diplomat. Bob Carr was another who was central in the anti-communist struggle within the labour movement. Bob is now a raconteur and a great man about town, and he's a contemporary figure, and the struggle against communism was 2 or 3 decades ago, so it doesn't define him today. But in those days, Bob had led the ideological resurgence of the New South Wales right of the Labor Party. He created the Mettle schools, which were ideological schools to train moderate social democrats against the far left. He'd been influenced by the AFL-CIO leaders in America who were profoundly anti-communist in the Cold War days, men like Al Shanker and others. He'd also been influenced by the West German social democrats. He understood that the communists were the mortal enemy of social democratic Labor parties and movements. And indeed, I recount in the book a lunch where I introduced Tony Abbott to Bob Carr, and Bob was making his general pitch for why we should all join the Labor Party. And one of his arguments to Tony was, look, if you want to fight the communists, and that's a good thing to do to fight the communists, don't join the Liberal Party. He said, there aren't any communists in the Liberal Party. It's a waste of time to join the Liberal Party. They have nothing to do. He said, if you want to really hurt the communists, join the Labor movement and fight them there. And a lot of the great people, really were motivated for their activism in the Labor movement substantially by their anti-communism. Really fine mainstream Labor figures, Barry Unsworth, Michael Eason, very good people. Barry Unsworth, incidentally, almost inspired Tony Abbott to join the Labor Party. He voted for Barry Unsworth, as I recall in the book. And you know, you've got to say, a lot of people were attracted to the Labor Party by Gough Whitlam or Bob Hawke or Mettle Rand. Not many were attracted by Barry Unsworth to join. And it's a tribute to Tony's sort of iconoclastic romanticism and contra mundum, contrarian thinking that it would be a Barry Unsworth. And I must say, I found Barry Unsworth very attractive too. The failure of Unsworth was the death of a dream for me, because I did believe that a socially conservative, old-style Labor man was the natural success story in Australian politics. But one after another, Des Corcoran, Ed Casey in Queensland, Barry Unsworth in New South Wales, they all failed. Bob Carr's success, I argue in the book, was that he did represent the soul of Barry Unsworth in the mean of Neville Wran. That's a bit unfair to Bob, he was much more than that. But there's something in it. He was socially conservative, profoundly anti-left. Malcolm Turnbull, the last person I'll offer any reflections on, was different. I think he was not as obsessed with the Cold War as the rest of us, but he was an immensely gifted intellectual, active at that time, and therefore he did engage with Cold War issues all the time. Malcolm was the only guy who made me feel a bit nervous as a young bloke, because he had so many things going on at once, and he was so good at all of them, that whenever I met him, I felt as though my tie was sort of not done up properly, and I think dishevelled, and I should work on some tremendously witty aphorism to share with him, you know, instead of which I'd end up stumbling and bumbling out some words. One of Malcolm's many gifts was that he could get interviews with anybody from the age of about 12. And I remember him interviewing Margaret Thatcher at the height of the Cold War, when Malcolm must have been 21 or 22 or something, and engaging with her in a very urbane, sophisticated way about the politics of the Cold War, writing about this in the Bulletin magazine, and that was the environment we all lived in. Now, that's enough about those people. Let me move on to the general propositions that I want to advance to you in this talk. One of the reasons for writing the book is that there were many episodes in the specific history of Cold War politics in Australia which had kind of disappeared from history. This is partly because the group I was involved with, Santa Maria's National Civic Council, in the early 1980s, it had a big split, and its trade union segment split from Santa Maria himself. And in 1983 or 84, under the guidance of Bob Hawke, the NCC trade unions came back into the Labor Party. It then became in everyone's interests, both those unionists and the Labor people who sponsored them, to play down their NCC connections. But as a result, some of these great union figures died. Jim Marr of the Shop Assistants Union, Mike O'Sullivan of the Clerks. And the Cold War and their NCC connections had been the heart and soul of their lives. And yet they died, and the obituaries were published of them and didn't mention the NCC, didn't mention the Cold War. The left, of course, are quite happy to have a lot of this erased from history, because the left's performance throughout the Cold War from start to finish was utterly discreditable, dishonest, wrong, unprincipled, crook, sometimes corrupt, just utterly discreditable at every point. And it likes to pretend, it likes to present communist activism as a struggle for equal pay for women cleaners or something like this, whereas in fact it was in the service really of Soviet foreign policy for most of the Cold War. But as a result, huge episodes of Australian politics had been kind of whited out, especially struggles within the trade union movements. That's one of the reasons that I wrote the book. But I do also propose a reflection on what it means now that we live in a comprehensively post-Cold War society. Kim Beazley, I thought, made a very telling remark early on in Barack Obama's presidency that Obama was the first post-Cold War American president. Now, of course, other presidents had ruled in the post-Cold War period, first Bill Clinton, then George W. Bush. But both Clinton and Bush, although their own predominant political commitments were not foreign policy commitments, nonetheless both of them had their strategic values completely formed in the Cold War. Clinton was at Oxford, Bush was, his father was president when the Cold War was brought to an elegant end. They both struggled with the politics of the Vietnam War and so forth. They completely absorbed the Cold War. Obama was the first person who had, the first president who had not been formed intellectually by the Cold War. Now, Kim is a very fine diplomat and he has not expressed himself on the quality of the Obama presidency, so I don't want to associate him with my judgments on Obama. But I think Obama has been a very poor president of foreign policy, especially in his second term. And this coincides with the disappearance of the last Cold War figures from his administration, particularly Robert Gates and Hillary Clinton. And the generation which Clinton has turned to now, I think, is a postmodern generation. And I'll come back to what I mean by that in a minute. In the last few minutes, what are the consequences of the end of the Cold War for the two sides of politics? I think Social Democratic and Labour parties in the Western world have moved more left in recent years. They've lost the old binding glue of the Cold War, which defined for them what they were against and what they were in favour of. They were in favour of a mixed economy, civil liberties, democracy, and human rights. And by human rights, they didn't mean this ludicrous debate we have now about whether if you pay a woman twice for maternity leave, but only pay her once, that's a breach of human rights. I mean, it may be good policy to pay women twice for maternity leave, I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not a question of human rights. Whereas in the Cold War, we knew what human rights were. Human rights were when you got thrown in the gulag or stood up against a wall and shot, or had your liberty taken away. That was what human rights were about. Social Democratic and Labour parties have lost any rationale for having sort of centre-right groups within their parties, and they've drifted more to the left. Combined with that, the global financial crisis of 2009 has led them to very mistaken conclusions about what is wrong with the international economic order, and their response has been, we were not left-wing enough in our response to the 2009 global financial crisis, so we have to become more left-wing. And there is no centre of gravity bringing them back. I think in the Australian context, it's quite possible that Bill Shorten will be the last right-wing Labor leader we see for a very long time. And in most of the Labor parties, analogous parties around the world, the left is now triumphantly in control. So much so that we may have the lunatic result of this Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labor Party in Britain. Truly a bizarre result. But the end of the Cold War has also had big problems in centre-right parties. The centre-right politics around the world, except in Australia, has so far fractured very badly. And the centre-right parties also no longer have the sense of making a society-wide compromise which produces a coherent program which includes appealing to the interests of the working class and finding a good balance between the impulses of capitalism and the impulses of social amelioration, and binding citizens together in the national interest in the great struggle against communism. Instead now, the right is fracturing into libertarian strands, populist strands, ultra-nationalist strands, and it's remarkable that it's held together so well in Australia. Australia is an outlier in having the vast bulk of right-wing centre-right votes going to the Liberal National Coalition in the lower house. And it may be that Tony Abbott is the last Conservative politician who can hold that coalition together. There's been, I think, a decline in Western solidarity and a decline in self-confidence in Western societies about Western values. When you were contrasting Western values all the time with communism, it did force you intellectually to think through what your values were. And that, I think, has led to a certain collapse of purpose in our civic culture. What are the positive lessons of the Cold War which we could apply today? one of the central ones is the importance of alliances. The Cold War, we prevailed in the Cold War because of the global American alliance structure. And anyone who is educated in the Cold War is educated in the fundamental importance and the centrality of alliances. And they understand what alliances mean. The great Rich Armitage once said to me, and he's also said it at conferences that I've been at, an alliance means this: I'll fight and die for you, and you'll fight and die for me. We don't tend to think of alliances in those terms these days because we live in this kind of postmodern world where conflict is meant to be abolished, except of course that everyone who in the world who is not postmodern doesn't think that conflict has been abolished and is quite happy to proceed with conflict. The Islamic State and all the other actors in the Middle East and even powerful states in our region. But the key importance of alliances is fundamental to any chance we have at a global order, and alliances are framed in the West. This is one of the central weaknesses of Obama. He doesn't understand or value alliances. Second lesson of the Cold War is the importance of values in foreign policy. You know, there's a faux sophistication which says we're all realists. Nations only act in terms of their interests and never in terms of their values. Of course, mostly nations act with an interplay of their interests and values, and mostly nations believe that their values and their interests coincide. But sometimes, even when they don't, they'll choose their values over their interests. They'll go to war for a friend, or they'll endure subpar economic outcome because they need to impose sanctions on Iran to stop it from getting nuclear weapons, or whatever it might be. The third great lesson of the Cold War is the ability to endure psychologically and politically a long war. The Cold War was a long war, from 1945 really to 1990, 45 years. It's a very long war. And in retrospect, it seems inevitable that the West was going to prevail, but at the time it was not inevitable at all. I grew up reading books with really depressing titles like How Democracies Perish by I think it was Jean-Francois Revel, or The Suicide of the West, I think was at Burnham. And there were many, many books like that. But you had to have a certain stoic psychological commitment to a long struggle, which meant high defence budgets, high salience for national security, high salience for alliances. You didn't expect victory tomorrow. You didn't get impatient with the failure of terrorists to surrender after 5 minutes in the battle. The Cold War also taught us a certain balance. We had to live happily and normally, but we had to have this mortal struggle going on at the same time. It always was 1 minute to midnight in the Cold War. The Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear warheads aimed at Western targets, including Australian targets. If things had gone wrong in Cuba or elsewhere, there might well have been a nuclear exchange. The fact that we haven't had one is a great triumph of our species, but there was nothing inevitable about it. It's not the common law, it's not bound by precedent. There's nothing inevitable in the future that we won't have nuclear exchanges, especially as weapons are proliferating, as I believe they will with Iran. It also should teach us the possibility of treachery, that people can betray their own societies and their own values for money or for ideological purposes. The Cold War should also teach us about the attraction of extremist ideologies. At a time when we knew all the truth about the Soviet gulags, the forced collectivization, the famines, the tens of millions killed by communism in the Soviet Union and in China, there were 23,000 members of the Communist Party in Australia. Hundreds, thousands of academics took the totalitarian temptation. It didn't matter how intelligent you were, a strong, purposeful ideology, no matter how extreme or bizarre, can be very attractive. The Cold War taught us the importance of having a sense of purpose in our policy, and it also showed us the importance of the wider world. When I was active in student politics, we all had to have an interest in Slavic culture because we all had to understand something about the Soviet Union. The Americans put out splendid journals like Problems of Communism, which we all read very earnestly every month, trying to understand this thing that we were up against. And I think, oddly enough, now we're probably more provincial as a society than we were in 1975. Specialist groups are isolated in their specialist websites, and the great mass of the rest of us is following the Kardashians on digital media, and think generally that everything is a Zionist conspiracy or something like this. So, I mean, I'll finish there with the odd thought that although I'm glad we won the Cold War, I sometimes rather miss quite a lot about the Cold War. I'll leave it with that. Thank you.